What's up, everyone? Welcome to episode 16 of What's That Sound podcast. My name's Stu Watts, and today I talked with Sam Swain, who is a Melbourne-based rock and pop producer, engineer, and musician. Today we talked a lot about the ins and outs of working with a band as a producer, how to get in a great creative flow state with artists, as well as an extensive chat about his mix process. So for all that and more, stay tuned to this episode of What's That Sound podcast. You're listening to What's That Sound with your host, Stu Watts. What's going on, everyone? Welcome to another episode of What's That Sound. My name's Stu Watts, and today I am here with Sam Swain. Sam,
Hello.
Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Stu. So happy to be here.
No, you're very welcome, and same goes. Glad to have you here. Tell us a bit about yourself, man. Let's kick it up with what you do in the music industry and how long you've been doing it for, etc.
Okay, cool. Well, these days I work as a music producer and a mix engineer and sometimes live musician. And I've been doing different types of music, bits and bobs, pretty much straight out of high school, which for me sort of professionally is since like 2011, 12. And yeah, these days I have a studio in Collingwood that I sort of co-run with a small label called Sunset Pig.
Yep.
And I actually pretty much work out of there exclusively, not as any sort of hard and fast rule, but it's just so familiar and it's what I know.
Yeah. Fair enough.
And then, yeah, there's actually the first year that I only have played one gig for the whole year, which is really unusual for me. But the people I tend to play with, they all went off and did cool overseas things, which was awesome for them. So,
right. Yep.
They're all doing things.
Yeah.
But
nice.
that's about it, really.
No, good stuff. And let's take it back to where music first came into your life. Tell us about your childhood with music. Was it a big part of your life back then?
Well, it was funny, like preparing for this, I re-listened to a couple of the podcasts.
Yep.
And I think I'm pretty late to the music game, actually, in terms of that. Both of my parents are not very musical. My dad works in science and my mum is in public service.
Yep.
And so I began playing drums in year 8 with no real music, anything before then. No church, no nothing that was even sort of auxiliary music. It was really when I started playing drums, I was like, oh, you can play music.
Yeah.
So that's kind of funny. And it was also I started playing soccer at the same time. It was literally just sort of I need some hobbies that aren't video games.
Yeah. Yep.
So it starts with drums for me in year 8, and then pretty quickly the pretty classic thing. I did do drums all the way through high school, but the classic thing where I was like, oh, you can't really write a song on a drum kit. So I started teaching myself guitar right after, pretty much.
Yeah.
I only ever did one guitar lesson, learned the pentatonic, minor pentatonic, and I was like, I think I got it from here.
Love it.
So yeah, that's sort of my musical origins.
What sort of tunes were you listening to back then?
Definitely the biggest one that stands out in my mind is Nirvana. I think that when I started playing drums, when I started playing drums, I'd already bought the second Gorillaz album, Demon Days, and that did blow my mind. And that was, on reflection, it's a very production-y kind of record to have as a first album. So it makes sense that I was so into the sounds. But at the time, I was just like, oh, yeah, this is cool.
Yeah.
And but then, I remember my drum teacher, we learned Come As You Are, and I was like, oh, this is pretty nifty. And then I just sort of deep dived. And I loved, it really resonated, which is interesting, even in year 8, which not like I was being told I couldn't play music by anyone, but I just loved the Kurt Cobain kind of ethic of just DIY, just give it a crack. Don't feel like you can't teach yourself, which is also cool as well. I'm impressed by my younger self that I was like, oh, well, I could teach myself guitar. How hard could it be? And it was just from people like the Kurt Cobain types there, just being like, oh, who cares? Just
Yeah,
especially once you
absolutely.
get power chords and bar chords happening.
I think it's crazy. Like I grew up on punk rock as well. It's like I mean, for me, it was like the hard and fast stuff, like Pennywise and NoFX, and just really intense. And it was just like it was, and yeah, like back then, I'm guessing we're of similar age, as I'm 35. I don't know how old you are,
Yeah,
but
a little bit.
yeah. So like it was like just chuck some guitars in the room, play some drums, and just have fun. It wasn't like you weren't thinking about even songwriting. You were, but
Definitely.
like it was a lot of covers, and it was a lot of just like
100%.
just having fun with mates and just turn it up as loud as you can, play as fast as you can. There wasn't any thought of production or anything like that back then.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think I feel like appreciating the craft of songwriting came way later for me. I was that classic band dude where I was like, I was just, like you say, the vibe, and also in guitar as well. But I was going to say drums. I did really like the physical nature of it. I think, as a young person, you're usually getting a bit angsty around those ages, and there's a nice release to it as well.
Yeah.
And I still feel these days that, like, I know I'm biased towards something that has a sort of physical quality to it, and I like the idea of drums being hit pretty hard and usually like on top of the beat and like all pretty, rock punk influence stuff, which sometimes I need to like ease off on if it's not appropriate. But I know that when I hear that kind of very physical sound, I'm like, oh yeah, that's what it like. Yeah, that feels good.
Yeah. Very emotional response is
Yeah,
great way to put it.
And to the playing, and I love good songwriting these days, but definitely at the start I was like I wasn't so bad that I didn't listen to lyrics, but I was definitely like, if I can't feel the passion in the performance of the music, if I don't hear that, I'm totally switched off straight away. And now I'm better with that, like, because now, I don't mind hearing a synthesizer that might be a little harder to get like some humanness into it. But that was definitely my bias at the start. It needed to have a lot of passion. And otherwise I was like, well, why even play if you're not going to hit it hard?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was similar. I'm not as much lyric based, producer as a lot of people are. I'm definitely more start with the music and get that right as well. And for me, growing up, like I said, and then it moved into hardcore and stuff later in my high school years, and it was always just about like passion and aggression and just doing things as intense as you could. And I think that definitely like sticks out still to the music that I make as well. Tell me about moving on into like when you started to appreciate production and mixing and all that sort of thing. Where did that sort of come into play?
Well, I'll just have a little think for a sec, because I remember appreciating, which I think most young people do, that, albums have different sounds and stuff. And again, I think like looking back, I probably had a bias for the things like we just said, which is like big drums and stuff like that. But I don't really remember. I do know that somehow by the end of high school, I knew that the concept of a producer was a cool thing. So who was I inspired by, I wonder? I think it must have been Radiohead. I reckon it was Radiohead now that I think about it. I remember a lot of year 11 and 12 walks listening to Radiohead albums. And then probably, start. And actually, the other big thing that happened around when I was finishing high school, they did the From the Basement series of Radiohead, which that was really interesting. And on reflection, I realized that it was already now, I think I watched the In Rainbows one, which is already an album I loved. But then they sort of revealed the tricks, because they were like using different instruments for different songs, and you saw Johnny Greenwood doing weird guitar stuff or whatever. And I think it was a really visual like representation of like, oh, this is how you get these crazy cool sounds.
Yeah.
So I think it was probably that kind of world, even though I still don't think I knew more than like 3 producers at that point.
Yep. And so like then moving on to like when you really started to deep dive into it, who were the people that you were like looking at and listening to? Did your music kind of influences change as you started to learn things, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, well, actually, the other thing that happened in year 12 was I did get crazy on the Beatles. I went really, really deep on
Love
the
it.
Beatles.
Yep.
And I think actually I was always pretty into history of music and like, yeah, actually, as soon as I started playing, I would love the Wikipedia deep dives and learning what influenced which band and whether. And so I think actually what I did is when I finally clicked with the Beatles, which took a long time because the Beatles were around me, even though I said before there wasn't that much music growing up. When I finally clicked, I was like on the journey with them, which is how I love to listen to artists now. Is like try and absorb the first album so that you can understand, well, the second album they're going for this. And the Beatles are a great band to do that with because they literally just invent half the tricks along the way. And also their sort of budget and time for each album really grows. And it's so fascinating to see their creativity unleashed. And then around the similar time as well, I was big on Queens of the Stone Age, as a lot of cats like us probably were. And so I really liked Songs for the Deaf as well, which was Eric Valentine. And so that I sort of started getting pretty obsessed with him and trying to steal all his tricks.
Yeah, man.
So those are some of the big ones, I'd say.
Yeah, that's huge. And I love that you mentioned that the way that you listen to music from like discovering their early stuff and listening through to the later stuff. Cause I think I like these days, not so much, but obviously when you're younger, you have a lot more time on your hands and you have time to really look into and deep dive into discover music. And I think I really did enjoy also like hearing the back catalog and seeing where they came from, not like as a conscious thing, but it was just a discovery type deal. And you can really hear like the low budget stuff shows to me a lot more, I don't know, passion and like, cause when you're first starting in a band, you really just go with all of your influences. You don't necessarily have your own voice. So it's like, you can hear where people really have come from with their earlier stuff. And then they start to discover what their sound is and then approach that in their own ways from, the third or fourth album onwards. So super fascinating. I love that.
Yeah, definitely.
And Eric Valentine, one of my favorites. Don't necessarily love his mixing, but his approach to recording and music and stuff is just like the GOAT, like unreal.
Definitely.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, I love his and he's just so committed. I love how whenever you go on a deep dive on Eric Valentine, you'll figure out that he's like, I spend 3 hours tuning my floor toms. So I'm like, okay.
Yeah, I know.
But it's awesome. He gets great results. Man.
And it's nice when you have your own studio. So it's like a different story as well. Tell me about like how you got started in the early days of your work.
Yeah. Well, I did do a course. I studied at SAE. And I had a good time there. And so when I was there, I was lucky enough pretty early on that a friend's mum got me a gig at Monash University. So I was working doing sort of like live event sound there for them. Mm-hmm. And that was really good. I reckon anyone on the younger side, those jobs sound annoying, but they're really good for fundamentals. Like and also speed, like you have to be quick. So really value that time. But when I was in uni, I was the guy who would use as much studio time as I could, but also hassle the lecturers to try and get them to let me work as assistants for them. And so that's what I did do, which was really cool. So I did a bit of assisting for Alex Markwell at the start. He's like a guitarist of Delta Rigs. That really blew my mind. And then, and actually did a bit of classical recording around that time as well, which was also really good for, broadening skill set. But eventually all these little jobs led to, I was lucky enough to assist at Sing Sing for quite a while and did that whole thing. And then while that was happening, slowly getting my own studio space and building up my own sort of situation. But yeah.
Yeah. So tell us more about those experiences, like learning off other people and, being immersed in the studio world, not necessarily of styles of music that you potentially like loved, but really like broadening your musical horizons, like you said, and tell us a bit about that. What was that like?
Yeah, well, Yeah, it's a good point. I just got to sort of think a little bit about it. Like when I first did some work with Alex Markwell, I was like, I was really green then. Like I actually don't know if I'd really been in a proper studio yet. So
Yeah.
it was like mind blowing. It was so awesome. And you know, those experiences are just like, I think just like how when we were talking about when you're absorbing a band and you're absorbing their sort of raw interactions, I feel like that's learning how a band psychologically exists as a unit.
Right.
And then
Yeah.
these early experiences was really good to absorb, like how does a studio sort of function in real life? Like what are the sort of the hierarchies, sort of who, you know, what's controversial to bring up, what's not controversial, how prepared are bands and stuff like that. So I think a lot of that at the start, like just getting to know, you know, and I did also have that goal from the start. I knew that I did want to try to work at a bigger studio. So it was valuable as well just to be like, cool, this is sort of like training for assisting more professionally. Where do I fit? When do I speak up? When do I not? What do I just do stuff in the background? How much do I chat to the band or am I annoying them?
Yeah.
So that kind of thing was really good. And like, you know, in the classical world, you get a really fun experience as well because classical musos are usually pretty, you know, they might be even more precious. So that's exciting. You're like thinking about things like air conditioner fucking settings is important to them and stuff like that. But it's good to appreciate that. And actually the classical world's good because they don't hide behind anything. Like they literally have to just bring it with their instrument. So making them really comfortable is a super high priority, which is always important for an artist. But that was probably a good experience as well.
I love that. That's so cool. It's so cool. And I think, yeah, like the personality things are like some of the most important parts of being a producer is even completely irrelevant to the music. It's like it's personalities and how you deal with people and how you talk to people, how you set up what you're going to do for the day. Like all that stuff's got nothing to do with music, but it's super important because if you have a really like bad interaction with any of the band members that you're working with or, you know, whatever, or their managers or something like that, any of those little things that happen, you're going to ruin your name potentially and just give them a bad experience, which will lead to a shitty song. Like it will at the end of the day, if someone's uncomfortable, they're not going to perform very well. So so good, man. I love it. Talk to me a bit about your like recording process now. What does that look like? Is it the same every time? Is it different for different artists?
Yeah, okay. I think it is pretty similar. I think in my mind, actually, I probably think of it as they're like as a process or like when I've already worked with someone, that's sort of one thing. And then the very first time with someone is a different thing. If I've already worked with someone, you know, it's a lot more simple. They sort of know by that point that that I'm kind of really open to receiving any form of demo. So it can be like really simple, just the guitar and voice or whatever. Or it could be something that they actually cook up on their own computer and they try and make it sound half good or whatever. And we just go back and forth. With newer artists, it's a bit more involved, and we like it's good to have conversations. It's good to always have to, or usually have a catch up beforehand. You usually try and meet all the band members beforehand if you can, at the very least. Like obviously, there's pre-production stuff like that, which is good when you can. It just reminded me of a funny question that I think is an Eric Valentine trick, but I always liked that he said he asked the question, is there any music that you hate? Not that I think people should hate music, but to know where your artist definitely doesn't want to go is very valuable. So I do try and find that out pretty soon. Then you know you're not gonna try and reinvent a band like, oh, this band would sound way better with like, you know, electric drums, and they go, we hate electric drums. You just never have that moment. So that could be fun.
That's cool.
But yeah.
I love that. Now, your music, I've been listening to it all this morning, and you know, the thing that I really appreciate about your music is how like restrained it sounds, and that might sound critical, but I mean it in a really in a positive way. The lo-fi aspect, the kind of the noise that a lot of producers would like to remove from their music. I think you really like value that and showcase it somewhat. And man, I want to know more about that, because how hard could it be? Like, you don't always work on really raw, punky, raucous music. You do some pop stuff as well. So tell me a bit about that and how you can stay restrained, and where did that come from as well?
Okay, yeah, definitely. Well, it's funny, like with you saying like even showcasing the noise or something like that reminds me of when another thing I used to love to do with the Beatles is, and you still can, you can often find on YouTube just like someone's uploaded just the drums or something like that of a track. And I love like how often you can hear someone like talking in the background, or George's like acoustic tracks, he's mumbling, that kind of stuff. I just always loved those little Easter eggs. And same also going back to Demon Days, like albums like that are really layered. And if anything, I think a lot of my style originally started coming from, I was always, and I've grown from this, but at the start I was like, there should just be heaps of layers, every song heaps of layers. And so now I'm a little bit more like, okay, sometimes that's not needed, but I think to just kind of try and fit all those layers in, if you actually do want to be able to hear the different layers, they all need to have a lot of personality as well. So I think I was never shy of like putting a lot of character on a track or on a whatever. So that, if you got a lot of guitar parts, the guitars need to sound very different, or if you want this random sound to cut, it needs to have a very unique frequency response for the song or whatever like that. So yeah, that kind of thing. I mean, yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that like what you meant by restraint?
Yeah. Well, I mean like a thing, all the elements having a space that they sit in. And so, obviously when you have loud guitars, they're loud. I've noticed that as well. Like the guitars are really just like they're louder than a lot of the vocals, the drums. The drums kind of sit in the back for a lot of like the heavier stuff, which you don't always see. So yeah, where did that all come from? Where was that influence from?
Cheers, man. Yeah, that's an interesting insight. Definitely in the sophisticated Dingo world, we definitely push the envelope with that. Well, I remember, I have a vivid memory. Actually, this is another uni memory. I think my friend Dave Turner, who was a lecturer then, we were talking about Motown albums and how shockingly quiet the drums are sometimes. And that sometimes is because, they're in a room and it's just in the back of the room or whatever. But I remember we had this great chat about how it still had impact, and it was really interesting to sort of just to try and get our brains around, like, how could you have impact and not have loud drums? And the other thing is, I think at the start I probably mixed drums way too loud. So I think I slowly was like challenging myself to do less of that. I don't know. I think it probably comes back to that band thing as well. Sometimes when I do play guitar in bands, I often turn the guitar too loud. So it's just like, but that sort of feeling and wall of soundy kind of feeling as well. I like that. And I also love in a mix, I try and put like high contrast between different elements, like you said, like, so you got all the spaces, but also between different sections. So I'm always tempted to make the jump from the pre to the chorus or whatever, like pretty ridiculous.
Yeah. It's great, man. It's great. Tell me about working with different artists. What are some of the difficulties that you think that you face in sessions? Are there commonalities, or is it kind of different for every band?
That's a good question. There are definitely like the cliche things. I think your singer being confident really helps, and your drummer being confident really helps. I think if personally, if I'm going into a session with an artist and they've got a great drummer and or great singer, I'm way more at ease, because I know that, like, I feel like it's a lot easier for me to coach the rest through. But firstly, if you don't have a great drummer, you need to have great drums, so you're gonna have to put a lot of work in to get that foundation solid. And if you don't have a confident vocalist, it's just I feel like you do end up spending more time coaching and also just sort of like almost just like kind of like getting through the session. Like you still might get great results, but I feel like great vocal sessions are when it's more like, I'm biased to guitar again, but when it feels like it's more like guitar where anything, they're just sort of up for anything and they'll just try stuff and like, oh, let's crack a harmony, just go, you know, and then you can get really creative and the flow of the vocal session will be really fun. But when you have vocal sessions where the singer is a little bit more like, oh, I don't even trust myself to hit these notes, even if they can, it can mean that you know, I just can picture always my notebook becomes very technical and I'm like trying to write pitch things instead of like vibe, great, big tick. You know, that's what I want to write on a vocal take. And then I'm just like, sweet. We're like, you know, so, you know, but that's cool. But I think you can get around that where hopefully your singer's rehearsed a bit. Hopefully you should definitely do vocal warm-ups, all that sort of stuff really, really helps. Have some tea around or whatever gets, you know, the juices flowing. But yeah, I think that those are they're probably the two big anchors, I think, because I think even I mean, I'm mostly a bass player these days, so I'm pretty strict on bass. But with guitar and other things, like even if it's a bit more, if it's a more of a humble player, that can actually be a great sound, and it can also push you towards not overthinking things and just going for a simple win. So that doesn't stress me out as much. But yeah, when you got a singer or a drummer, you know, if a drummer that wants it to be to click, but they're not great to click or something, that can be challenging for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the point that you made about the flow state, because you're right. When you have to do a lot of coaching or you have to navigate, you know, arguments in the studio or things like that, people disagreeing on stuff, it becomes less about the music. Even if they are arguing about the music, it becomes less about that and more about like, okay, how do I navigate this? How do I work around it? How do I try and get the best out of people? And like you said, when people just trust each other and they're confident, confidence is a huge thing. You know, when they're confident, when they trust each other, when they trust you as a producer, it just means that you're just kind of trying more stuff out and trying to get the best possible product. And yeah, if someone is kind of argumentative or something like that, or they, like you said, usually comes from a lack of confidence, then it just becomes a little bit harder to actually get the results. And
for sure,
you know, at the end of the day, you probably still, if you know,
you'll get there. You will get there.
You will get there, but it's just going to be a little bit harder and potentially take a lot longer. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that's awesome. What are some of your favorite kind of times that you've had in the studio? When you think back and you're like, that was amazing. I've walked out of that session being like, that was so sick. That was the best session I've ever had. What's that? Is there like things that you can point out that you remember that you loved or?
Definitely. You know? Well, I've reckoned probably the biggest highlight of when I was assisting at Sing Sing, which is like a nice studio in Melbourne, if anyone doesn't know. I was really lucky to assist, and I actually, it's called Dragonfly, an album by Casey Chambers. Pretty sure it's called Dragonfly. And Paul Kelly was producing, and Stephen Schramm was engineering, and then it was Casey Chambers with like a red hot band. And I was just sitting in the old Neve room as the assistant, being like, "Oh, this is like elite stuff." And I remember like Schramm came in and he wanted to use certain plugins, which weren't even that controversial, but Sing Sing had like these older computers, so we were stressing trying to get the plugins going, and just funny stuff like that. But once we got it going, I mean, that was one of those sessions where the skill level was so high of everyone that it was very, very smooth. And like Paul Kelly was spending most of the session in the live room with them, just sitting with headphones on, talking music, talking shop, just talking like, what if we put this bass note under this chord? And then Shram just running Pro Tools in the desk. And it was really cool. That was an awesome session.
Wow.
And then like recording sessions, I remember like Rat Hammock, a band I've worked with heaps, a really, really late night crazy session trying to finish their song June, which is one of their first bigger songs. And and that was a bit of a flow state kind of situation where which we always have done with that band. We're just going really deep and getting crazy and plugging the wrong thing into the wrong thing. And, you know, I'm just, you know, like I've got Jackson's acoustic with a like tape on pickup or something going into a fuzz pedal, going into like a Supro amp that my friend Dave left there. And then that was like I don't even remember if that is on the song, but I just remember it being just so distorted. And then you could talk into it, and we put some of that talking into the song. But yeah, that was a good moment as well, for sure.
Yeah, that's sick. And like, what do you think contributes to like those really good sessions where, you know, and it might be an everyday session that, you know, you might just be recording guitar the whole day or recording drums. Like what about it do you think is like enjoyable about being a producer these days?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I think going back again to the flow state concept, what I love about that is when I get really excited is when someone suggests or tries something that surprises me, and I'm like, not to say that I can foresee everything, but when you get those moments, you're like, whoa, that shouldn't work, and that sounds awesome. Or, you know, like it's also really nice when you've got a band member that feels empowered enough, like maybe they've come out of their shell a bit because you've worked together a couple of times, and they suggest a really wacky idea, and it's actually really good, and you're like, yes, this is so awesome. Because I do love in bands when you feel like you can get everyone's personality sort of into the melting pot, and it's not too much of like one person just running the shop. So those things all excite me. Also, great sounds is fun, like trying to challenge myself with sounds if someone brings in an interesting instrument. But yeah, all those kind of things, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool point. And I also agree that like when, you know, people challenge you as a producer, it's some of the, like in a good way, not in like you're a dick way, like in a good way, like where they're like, I want to achieve this, and it's not necessarily something that you've tried before, and you have to really use your brain and go, okay, I've seen something like this before. Yes. I'm going to give this a crack and see if it works. And yeah, you might get a completely different result, but you know, those sorts of creative processes with artists that really have a creative brain, they're not just there for you to be like, do everything. They're the ones that like, you know, like they're like, you know, let's do this, blah, 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 whatever it might be. And you're like, cool, let's have fun here and try and, you know, like you said, just chuck stuff into the wrong pedals or use the incorrect plugins and see what comes out of it. They're always super fun times. Yeah. Hey, thanks so much for listening so far. There is plenty more to come, so don't go anywhere. I just wanted to let you know that this podcast is made completely independently by myself with no sponsors. So if you like what you hear and you would like to show your support, you can send a donation to the PayPal link, paypal.me/whatsthatsound. The link is also in the show notes. Thanks so much for your support, and let's get back to it. All right, man. Well, tell me more about, you know, your percentage of kind of time division between production, recording, mixing. What does that look like?
Yeah, that's a fair question. Well, there's more mixing than there used to be. Like one funny side effect of lockdowns and stuff is, as a lot of us experienced, suddenly it was harder to work. And so, yeah, I ended up doing heaps of mixing over the COVID years. I was pretty much just only produced, I'd say, probably like 2 EPs worth a year. These days, it's probably like 50% produce, record, do the whole thing, 40% just mixing, and then 10% like random jobs, where I'm just doing the drums or just doing the whatever. So maybe something like that.
Do you like the production and stuff more, getting in the rooms with people, or do you prefer mixing?
I actually love mixing these days. And that was another funny side effect of lockdown, right up until lockdown. And again, not as a hard rule, but I was really into the idea of being a producer. And so I rarely worked on something that I didn't record. Like probably then it was probably like 1 in 20 things. So I love mixing these days. I think if it's an artist I love producing, which actually I usually only work with artists I love, so I don't know. But
that's true.
Sometimes mixing is the most fun. Like it can be. These days, if I'm on a roll with a mix, I'll easily mix for hours, and it's not that you should be doing that as well for ear fatigue, but I find myself really getting easily lost in having fun in a mix. So
yeah.
I
love it, man. It's funny because it's like, I agree. The same thing happened to me with COVID, of course. Like, so I don't work at my own studio. I work at Marshall Street Studios, which is a commercial recording studio.
Yeah.
And yeah, the same thing happened. I was only able to work from home, and the studio's closed down. So yeah, same sort of thing. I wasn't able to do any production, wasn't able to do any songwriting with artists or anything like that. And there was a lot of mixing, but yeah, I think it's funny because, you know, when you're in the studio with an artist, you're so focused on the song, and you know, I feel like, I don't know what it's like for you, but I feel like all of my time just disappears because it's like there's so much intense focus. You can't focus on the outside world so much. You know, the only time that you can do that is when you're having breaks, and my time just disappears. But with mixing, it's another thing where your head's in a screen, and you know, at the end of the day, I'm so like zoned out when I get home to my wife and stuff. I'm like, I can't even like focus on the conversation that we're having because my brain's just gone. I don't know. It's a funny thing that happens. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think I definitely noticed that as well, like easing off and doing as much production. Like when you're producing, I also definitely produce, as it sounds like you do as well, in quite a holistic sense. So I'm part of like every single part of the thing. So it's, as you say, it's very intensive and time intensive, and it's a lot of hard work. So that was another thing I've loved about mixing, is it feels more like you're getting commissioned to do a painting or something. Like you can just kind of come in and do all your colors and then go out. And then also the thing I love about mixing, especially with something I didn't record, I really like to mix with a lot of color, like give them the Sam Swain version. Like I would be happy to release it as the first mix. And then when they come back to feedback, like that's almost more like a tradesman or something where I'm like, oh yeah, no worries, I'm happy to change these things. Like it's so easy to define where I get really creative and then when I be really like functional, where production is also tricky like that because it's just a constant schmeary. You're doing all kinds of jobs, all kinds of hats, all kinds of levels of depth of how much you're telling them to change everything or change nothing. So yeah.
It's a great way of putting it, man. I love that. Tell me about your mixing process. What does that look like? Again, is it the same? Do you have like templates, or is it different every time? Do you challenge yourself to like be creative with mixing and stuff like that too?
These days I try and use templates a little bit more, and that was also from doing more mixing work. It just became a reality. Very simple templates. Like I just have like when I begin a mix on drums, like I've already got like my kick. It's not even a kick channel strip. I literally just have like 10 inactive plugins that I know I like on kick. and they are saved on pretty much all the plugins I use. I save them on the preset they open with how I would use them the most. So I know when I activate that plugin, it'll pretty much instantly sound like how I want it to sound. Yeah. And I can go from there. So I do stuff like that to save time.
That's awesome. I love that. I love that.
But I do I guess I often do build from the drums up. It depends on if I record it or not. Again, I really, 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 really am into having any kind of mixing switcher where you can switch to the previous mix or a reference on a button as well. Like I know you can do it in software, but I like it when it's instant. And I really like to check the rough bounce or the artist bounce or whatever a lot, because it's really easy to go down the wormhole and think like, oh, this is definitely way better than it started. And then you check and you like get really humbled. Like even yesterday I was finishing a mix at home and I flicked to my rough mix. So I'm only battling myself. And I was like, God damn it, this snare is better before. And that's like hours into the mix. And so then I just tweak things, or sometimes I like to import the settings that I had on the snare and just look at them and be like, oh, okay, it's probably this. So I'm big on that. And then I also, these days I try a lot harder, even if it's, sometimes I'll bounce just the vocal stem of my rough mix. And I just try and turn that on often. So even if I'm not up to the point where I'm trying to mix vocals properly yet, just so you get the full vocal experience around, like just keep that in your mind so that all the moves you're making are supporting the vocals and you're not like making some awesome drum sound that you realize like, oh, that is just going to squash the vocals and won't make any sense later. So I like to try and do that, which it requires a bit of discipline because it's always fun to listen to drums in solo, but trying not to solo too much is also a good thing.
Yeah, it's fascinating you say that because it's like, you can really get stuck in the weeds there. But I Yeah, it's funny when you have those moments of like, shit, I should have just kept it where it was. I liked it at the time. Why did I keep going?
Yeah, definitely.
You're like an hour later, you're like, shit. But yeah, man, I think that's great. That's really good advice as well, is to, you know, listen to things in context, because you never know when you're going too far with something and you can really blow out, you know, and ruin what the actual song is actually trying to be.
Yeah, well, that's true as well. True, definitely.
Yeah,
you can stamp all over the soul of the song.
Yeah, you can. And it's like, at the end of the day, you need to support what the song is trying to be. It's not about like, oh, I've got to get the best drum sound on every single song, because not every song needs
that's true.
amazingly blown out drum sound or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you have, you know, favorite things that you like to work on in a mix?
Well, I mean, I love mixing drums. I could easily, well, what I went and grabbed is and this is something new to me, and I think this isn't too crazy, but it's a bit fun. I have this timer these days. Ooh. And so I got off Amazon. If you put it down, it just starts a timer for like 30 or 60 or whatever minutes. And I do sometimes use that when I'm mixing, because I know that I literally could mix drums for an infinite amount of time.
Yeah.
And so I have a little timer that goes off, because I once realized, or it's not that hard to realize this, but when you're just sort of doing the numbers of the business of your mixing career, you're like, okay, I probably can't afford to spend this much time on drums on every track. So it can be, I like that as a little thing to just be like, and sometimes I just ignore it and I'm like, yeah, I did just spend an hour on that. I don't care. But like, it's just good to, I feel like definitely with mixing more than anything, the time flows so easily for me that I will not keep track of it. So I do that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I love mixing drums. I love mixing bass as well. These days I kind of like, I do love mixing vocals as well. And these days I often sort of have my session set up that all non-vocal things go to an instrument bus eventually. And then the vocals are their own little world as well. So I do really like trying to polish the vocals and play, just slick the vocals up really well. So I do like mixing vocals pretty intrinsically, potentially, again, overkill. A really good tidbit for vocals that I heard from Dean Touza on Instagram was to, again, not to solo or try not to solo too much while you're cleaning up vocals, because I used to go crazy being like, I can hear clicks, I can hear mouth clicks, and you should get rid of them if they're bad. But he just made the point, he was like, look, if you can't hear those little random noises when the track is actually on, like all the music's in, it's probably not going to kill your mix, especially things like BBs and stuff. So I try and do that a bit more these days but usually I very manually will like tweak up the edit on my lead vocal. That I'm quite precious about, but these days I'm a little bit more happy to either ignore background vocal stuff or just to use the isotope noise reduction stuff and just go and do it a bit more uniformly.
Yeah. And it's funny you say that about like, the attention to detail when you're not when you're first starting, but when you're, a few years in and you have the realization that everything matters a lot. You can start to get too deep in the weeds, too deep into editing and cleaning things up. And I think it's funny, even my approach to mixing EQ and compression and stuff like that. It's very, very much these days broad strokes based. You got to do a little bit of cleanup and take out frequencies that you don't like, but only for me these days, only if it really annoys me, because it's all character.
Yeah, I like that.
And when you mix in solo, you can get really like you can just ruin a guitar sound by taking out or an overhead mics or a huge one, room mics. You can take out all the character. And at the end of the mix, you go, why the fuck does everything sound so wimpy or like like weird?
Yeah, for sure. These days, what I love about broad stroke, which I've also been trying to get more into, is I've been kind of, and this is not that scientific, even though I often am quite scientific with my thinking, is I like the idea if you use less steps to get to your final goal, things like phase and stuff will probably be a lot stronger as well. Like I was definitely also guilty of that back in the day, like my overheads would have like 5 notches where I'm like, this frequency is not allowed. And but I think that those things add up, and the phase just gets weirder and weirder or whatever. And maybe that's the sound you're going for. But I think broad strokes is good, and also ideally some of those things you've sorted out before you go to mix. Like if there was something that's vitally wrong, you clean it up while you record. And the other thing, just going back to vocals, I was thinking that I didn't appreciate at the start was, definitely like the fine art detail of like breaths and stuff, and really making it sound how you want it to sound in terms of, like I like to chop up the breaths and have certain breaths in and out, or turn the volume up and down. Sibilance as well is really hard. Someone I really like once put it that, like great vocal mixers have their sibilance is actually what they nail, because it's so hard to get a forward sort of like bright vocal that you like and then not just become like but anyway.
Yeah, man. No, it's so true. It's so true. Attention to detail is crucial, but not in like a ridiculous way. Like, like everything.
Not in a solo stem way.
Yeah. Everything matters, but sometimes those little things that you leave in are what make the song.
Yeah,
so it's really hard. Well. It's a hard line to toe.
Yeah.
Tell me about like things that you've kind of, added to your toolkit over time that have made your workflow in mixing faster.
Oh yeah, that's a good question. Well, I do love that Pro Tools has folders now. Didn't have folders for so long. That was really good. And also, because Pro Tools has like the different ranks, and I'm not exactly sure how it works, but I think it's maybe all of them have volume trim now, which is awesome. I love that.
Yep.
Other workflowy things. It's good to, commit your edits, like make sure you do begin a mix, try and have all the edits done and committed, and just not be looking at like chopped up drums and stuff like that. I think that's valuable. I think also doing a lot of experimenting and learning what you like on your mix bus and maybe instrument groups and stuff makes a big difference. Like, that's a little tricky for me to give that recommendation, in that I think if you don't know what you're doing, it's very easy to over-process the overall mix or whatever you're doing. But once you do have those tools that you know that you love, or they do exactly the job you want, that's helps so much. Like I find I generally try and mix with all my presets, like we said before, but I avoid putting too much on the mix bus early on. But I just sort of know that once I'm finishing up, once I start to turn them on and dial those in a bit more, it just automatically sounds more finished. So that really helps. And it's good. And, sometimes if I'm in a rush, I do start with more of that stuff turned on. So I'm sort of like, more compressors, more tape, whatever stuff. And so, and then, like there are cool guys like Chad Blake, he does his like mix with the masters things, and he's just got like 20 plugins turned on by default. And I'm like, yeah. But it's mad, because if he knows what his chain is and he knows what it all does, like he'll hear if a certain thing is doing the wrong thing or whatever. So I give that advice with some asterisks. But I think that speeds thing up as well. And especially getting your sound dialed in. If you
I was watching just a quick little YouTube video with Andrew Sheps on Mix of the Masters yesterday, and he had an EQ on the mix bus that he likes to use in all of his mixes, and his explanation was like, if you know that that's how you want the mix to sound at the end, why wouldn't you have it on at the start? And I was like, that's interesting, because I'm similar to you in the sense that I won't start with anything except a limiter on the mix bus, and all of the kind of creative or even technical things that I add to my mix bus at the end are purely for like vibe. And I haven't necessarily tried it, so I could be wrong here, but I would find that mixing into like a compressor that's got, crazy settings on it, I'm like, wouldn't that, be harder to do from the start?
It would definitely sort of traps you in that world to begin with. And I think that's where you got to decide, like, am I happy to be trapped in my usual box? And so that's definitely where I lean away from that normally, because I'm like, no, I need my options to go crazy and turn something up way too loud and it not just instantly get squished or whatever. But, especially with those big dudes, and I'm sure if your workload starts getting really big, speed is also a valuable thing to your clients. And so, like we were just saying, it's something to quick up your mix.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Let's get nerdy then and
Okay.
segue into your favorite pieces of gear.
Hell yeah.
Do you use like heaps of hardware when you're recording?
Yeah, so when at our studio, Sunset Pig in Collingwood, we got some nice bits of kit. Like we got the API like 4-channel mic pre one, whatever that's called. I forget all the names of all the things. We got the Cybertron pre's as well, which are pretty cool. We've got the Avalon 737.
737, yeah,
that's pretty cool. I really like that. We have the Distressor as well. They're sort of the highlights of our rack. I'm just trying to imagine it right now. And so I love all that. I love 57s.
What about microphones?
I love 57s. I think never look past the 57. I remember vividly a couple of good sessions at Sing Sing. So again, when I was assisting, and that's a mic locker that is like, elite. There's every mic you could think of and want is there. And they have modern, beautiful, like the TG mics and stuff. But so many times, like on a very big budget production, the producer's still going 57 on a Fender amp. Like they're not gonna. It ain't broke, so don't fix it kind of approach. So I really like 57s, and I think I would say to any producer, it's very useful to have a mic that you just know what it's going to sound like. It's such a good. Like I will almost always have a 57 somewhere in a guitar setup. We have a TLM 170, whatever it is, that little Neumann. It's actually a bit of a gun. I kind of like that. I used to
We've
not
got the
like
103 here.
Yeah. I like those. And they got a flavor, and it's good when you got a flavor.
Very pristine and hi-fi sounding. The
definitely,
TLM 103,
yeah, which I like. Trying to think of what else I normally go for. I mean, those are sort of the big ones. SM7 is kind of pretty hard to beat. On a lot of things. Yep.
What software stuff do you use? Pro Tools? What is it about Pro Tools what's the reason for using Pro Tools?
Well, I just, I have put so many hours into Pro Tools now. And I know, I think it's a little bit cool at the moment to not like Pro Tools. But I have just put so many hours in. I love it. It's funny people say it always crashes, and that is kind of true sometimes. But I also think it's got its own stability to it that I like. And I just know how to run it so well, and the shortcuts and the macros. I really want to get into SoundFlow. I don't know if any of your people have been talking about that. That's that like newish program. It's pretty cool. My friend Luke, not Luca, well, Luke would use it as well, but Tristan, that you can basically tell this program to do any chain of commands that the Pro Tools can do. And then you macro, and Stream, I think it's Streamlabs, like which of those controllers that have like 15 buttons. Then you map it on there. So you could, he made one, my friend Tristan made one where took all the UAD hardware versions of the plugins and automatically copied the settings and replaced them with the native UAD through a whole session. So he has a button that can just do that. So if someone sends him something to mix and he wants to convert it all to native, he just clicks that button and just goes, it takes a minute.
Unreal.
So I want to get into that world. That's pretty cool. And
that's crazy.
But, I just love, I actually love Pro Tools. I know, even though I think it's a bit uncool to like it these days. I do also have the Avid mixer fader things. Those are really useful. I'm sure you can do all of this with the other programs, but, it's just solid for me.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Let's talk about some of your favorite plugins that you can't live without, or that you find yourself using in every session.
Well, I was actually just thinking about today, a mix I just finished. I think I didn't use Soundtoys Decapitator at all on an entire mix for probably the first time in a long time. I was just like sitting at home after. I was like, oh man, I don't think I turned on decap today. But, the Soundtoys stuff is very, very, very functional and useful, but it's not very exciting. I think Baby Audio is a really cool company. If people haven't heard of them, they got some interesting plugins.
Tape, is that?
Yeah, TAIP. That plugin's cool. That plugin's really cool. It's got some weird sounds. I'm just trying to think what else I like. I do like. I think the company's Pulsar, PULSAR. They've got the Echo Rec like delay. That is like, that's the first ever time a software delay I was like, oh, I actually just love this completely. It's always noisy, which is really annoying, so I always put the fab filter gate afterwards. But that, like, it's hard. I think it's impossible to make that delay sound bad. That delay is really good. I like the MU they have, which is like the whatever compressor copier. I do use some of the UAD stuff. That's all pretty classic. Just trying to think of some of the more freaky plugins. I do really like RC20, which I think everyone knows about now. XLN. There's also Abhorrent DSP, which they've got their cassette thing, which I can't remember what it's called now, but it's pretty cool. I use all the Fab Filter stuff. Fab Filter stuff's really good. I'm sure there's more freaky plugins, but I'm trying to remember what they are now.
Do you have favorite like EQ, emulations that you go to or anything like that?
I find that I always have Fab Filter Pro Q, blah, blah, blah. That's always the non-flashy one.
Yeah.
And then I actually find I kind of shuffle through different ones. So at the moment, I'm using the UAD Pull Tech thing just because I'm on that scene. And actually, they did the Hitsville EQ, which is, I like ones where they do models of things I don't know that well, and so I don't overthink it. I'm just like, oh, what does this do? But the Pull Tech one's pretty cool. I like when companies do the API. Is it the 560 that is the graphic EQ version? Yeah. That's really fun. I just like anything where it's just like, bah! And you just sort of like. I love the color EQs to not be too specific. It's just kind of like we were saying, broad based.
The funny thing about the 560 is it's quite tame when you use it for like, less than 6 or 9 decibels. But as soon as you move it right to the edge, it's just like bang, like
and it's also
like, just so much.
And I do feel it's got a nice color to it, and you can always hear the difference, which I appreciate. And that's another thing I do also like to do is like with the color EQs, intentionally use different ones on different instrument groups or whatever I'm looking for separation from, like you probably would if you were really using them in a real studio. You'd only have one set and you'd put that on the guitars or whatever. That's probably EQs.
Compressors?
I've had the Empirical Labs Arouser, which was a pretty weird plugin because it's sort of their official distressor, except for it's not. And that plugin's very, very easy to use. I'd recommend that for beginners because I feel like that's another one that's really hard to make it sound bad. And they just updated it with a couple of extra new flavors. And it has a dedicated saturation dial, which is really fun. If you want that pretty classic, snare drum through a distressor sound, they got the pummel kick snare bus preset, and then you just put the saturation of taste, and it just gives it the kind of sound. So that's thuddy. So quick. And also the vocal, or the way it treats a vocal, is very quick and functional as well. This is another company that's sort of cool to not like, but Waves. I actually quite like, they did the R124, which is like a sort of Altec-ish Abbey Road thing.
Yep.
That one has like, they gave it this like super comp mode or something, and the red light turns on. That I literally only use on that mode, and that's insanely aggressive. So it's not like your classic like vintage, what you'd expect from an old Altec. It's like this weird modern hyper aggressive thing. So that's the one that I use a lot because I just know if I want something to be upfront the entire time it exists, it'll do that. Another one that's really cool, and this is kind of stretching your question, but the Isotope Neutron stuff is very interesting, and I really like the exciter in that and the transient designer, and actually the compressors in that are kind of not that exciting. But what I kind of use that, and I'm definitely thinking vibe when I use that, and it has the weird track assistant mode where you can tell it what it is, and then it tries. Yeah, well,
literally, I just picked that up for Black Friday specials, and I'm trying it on a couple of mixes that I've used, and it's weird because like you put in the sample that you want the snare to sound like or whatever, and I feel like I'm yet to kind of see it actually sound like it, and I know it's hard because it's basing it on a single sample, and it's trying to make a live drum sound into that sound, so I can't imagine how hard it would be to create that actual software, but it is fun. It's fun. It's like I wouldn't normally go for this snare sound, but it's sounding cool.
Exactly. I love plugins like the TAIP one as well, where they got just a bit of weird programming going on. But definitely the Neutron, it'll throw curveballs at you, which can be really good. Like if you're like, I feel like especially if I'm mixing something I didn't record and I'm like, oh, this doesn't have much vibe, it'll just like be like, here's a crazy idea. And then you go from there. And I often find that I turn off half of the things it does, but the things that it nails, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And but yeah, the only thing with Neutron is sometimes I feel like the phase is a little suspicious, but that's cool.
Yeah. Well, it's doing so many things. I can't imagine like what it's actually doing to the.
For sure. Which is
it's like it's one signal going through all of these different DSPs. It's like, what? It's like,
exactly,
it has to be doing something.
On the other side, it's like, ooh.
Yeah.
But yeah,
this has been awesome, man. Thanks for joining me. Before we finish up, though, if you've checked out a couple of the podcasts, you might have seen that I like to ask the same question at the end of all of the podcasts: is what pieces of advice do you have? First of all, for engineers and producers, and then I want to know what advice you might have for artists.
Okay, cool. For engineers and producers, what I usually say, especially if they're like earlier on in their career, I personally found it very, very useful to have any sort of studio setup, if you share with a couple of friends or whatever, that isn't in your house. Like, I think for me, when I started doing that and like you started having to pay some rent, so you sort of had overheads in your business, for me, that was valuable. I feel like that really forced me to, try and get more work in. It's just a good motivator and a good it's the first baby steps towards becoming more professional. I think for people that are more established, if I even have the authority to say this, I think definitely finding trying to find artists that you are going to gel with and just trying to make sure that relationship is good. And like you said earlier on about when you get that flow state, a lot of it is trust. And I think when I haven't loved working with an artist is when they don't back you in. So they don't trust you. They don't think that you're going to make a great idea. That's just going to be really counterintuitive to everyone's goal. So trying to achieve that is good. For artists, I mean, there's the cliches. It's always good to rehearse. It's always good to demo well. Maybe this just crossed my mind, is a little bit savage, but I think it's worth considering if the people in your band, something that I just see a lot is maybe just trying early on, and there's good websites for this, address sort of like the goals of the band and sort of have even finances, stuff like that. Try and zero that in so that, not to be too harsh, but I do think sometimes you can have in a band someone who's just not as committed, basically. And it can really slow a band down a lot, like heaps. Even if it's something simple like they don't want to put money in, that's going to make the budget harder. Or if they're just not putting the effort in, they're not practicing, or they're not as available as you've agreed to be or whatever. So I think if you're trying to do a band, it's really worth making sure that everyone's on the same page and everyone's equally committed. And also, just doesn't have to be vicious, but just have that agreed so that there's easy outs as well. If someone's too busy or whatever, they should be able to. And sometimes people just leave temporarily. They even come back after they finish uni or whatever's taking their time.
Great point.
So I'd say all that. And I think that's pretty good. Maybe for
beautiful. I love it. I think it is great. Like, communication is something that I harp on about nonstop. But if you can't have a two-way communication that is honest, and sometimes you have to have difficult conversations, you're just not going to get as far with anyone as you will as if you have
that's
that.
True.
And a band is a really great example of that. If someone's just not being honest, or I don't have time to do this, all you're going to do is hold the rest of the band members back. So it's so crucial that you have that two-way communication. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yep.
Awesome, man. Well, any last words before we start to wrap up?
Oh, not really. Just thanks for having me once again, and hope everyone has a lovely Christmas.
That's it, man. Thank you for joining us. Where can people find you online? And in person.
Well, in person, I'm in Collingwood, and I'm at gigs sometimes, playing gigs. I play with Josh Cashman. He's sort of like a sort of poppy singer-ish guy. And then sometimes Ryan Meeking, he's overseas at the moment though. So yeah. And then online, I've actually pretty much only got Instagram socials wise at the moment, which is Sam H. Swain, Swain. And then I have a website, which is samswain.com, which, that's pretty interesting. But
beautiful, man. Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you again for joining us today. It's been awesome.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome. And to everyone that has stuck around till the end, thank you so much. Thanks for always checking in and watching us. And what would really help me and the podcast out is if you could share this with a friend, whether that's directly or on your socials or anything like that. Spreading the word on this podcast really helps us get this information out to as many people as possible. And yeah, make sure you hit follow and subscribe, those classic things that everyone says on YouTube and everywhere else. But that'll just help you stay up to date with any new releases that we have, any new podcasts, all the amazing guests that we have on here. And yeah, thanks again for joining us. And we will see you next time on What's That Sound podcast. Thanks for listening to What's That Sound. Make sure you hit follow or subscribe on your podcast platform to stay up to date with each new episode. We'll catch you next time.